Hi gang, Mr. Gentry here. Today in class we talked about Oxy Acetelyne units, and so tonight for your homework I'm asking you to watch this video so that I can show you how to set an Oxy Acetelyne unit up, and that way we can have this process out of the way, and when we get into class tomorrow we have more time to actually practice. So as you can see, I've got my Oxy Acetelyne unit here. We use oxygen and acetylene for welding, cutting, and brazing. So we've got two bottles. The large bottle here is the oxygen bottle, and the short bottle here is the acetylene bottle. Both bottles are secured to my cart. As you can see, I've got them capped. But since how they're secured to my cart, I can go ahead and uncap these. And as we talked about today in class, these bottles are incredibly dangerous if you don't respect them. But as long as you have them secured to the cart, they're perfectly safe, and we can go ahead and we can uncap these. When we get these bottles from the gas company, we don't know what condition they're coming to us in. And we don't know how long they've been in storage or how they've been stored. So the first thing I like to do is crack my bottles to blow any dirt out. That way, I don't get a bunch of dirt into my regulators. As you can see here, I have two regulators, one green, one red, like we talked about today. Green is the oxygen, red is acetylene. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to put my regulator onto my bottle. I want to make sure that my two gauges are facing out so that I can see them. Notice that I don't put any kind of oil, any kind of Teflon tape, any kind of sealer at all on these threads. These threads are brass, and with the JIC fitting that these unions have, they will seal up. I take my crescent wrench and I snug the fitting up. I don't want to over tighten this fitting. Again, it's just brass. I can strip it or I can split this nut very, very easily. Now, on to my acetylene. One thing that I want you to notice about this acetylene is if you look right here, you can see on the nut that the nut has this line in it. That line means that these are reverse threads. So no longer righty-tighty, lefty-loosey, it's backwards. Now, this is really important to know, especially when you go to take this regulator off and you're not sitting there trying to over-tighten it. There it goes. It didn't want to start. Got it started now. Again, no oil of any kind on these threads, no Teflon. These threads will seal on their own. And I'll show you how to check these threads to make sure you've got a good tight seal on those here in just a minute. Again, take my crescent wrench, snug that nut down. That's all I need to do. You don't need to over tighten it. Next step is my hose. I have two nut ends, and just like on my acetylene regulator, my acetylene nut on my hose has a notch down the middle, which means these are backwards threads. So I take green to oxygen, bring it around, and secure my fitting to the regulator. Red acetylene comes back to the acetylene regulator, backwards threads. Again, no Teflon, no oil, just my crescent wrench, and I want to snug these fittings down. Don't want to over tighten them, I just want to make them snug. Perfect. Next step is our torch. What we have here is a cutting torch. We have an oxygen trigger here. We have an oxygen valve. We have a second oxygen valve, and we have an acetylene valve. And if you ever become confused, just look on the torch itself because it's labeled. Here's an O for oxygen, and here's an F, and the F stands for gas. So, these are quick couplers. I just take and push these onto the torch. Red for oxygen, green for oxygen, red for acetylene, excuse me. Okay, I have my torch on. I make sure that my valves are closed. On this cutting torch, this first oxygen valve I want to leave open. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to control my oxygen flow with my second valve at the top. Okay, we've got our regulators on, we've got our hoses on, we're ready to pressure test our Oxy Acetelyne unit to make sure that there's no leaks anywhere. First thing I want to do is I want to make sure that I have my regulator shut off. So I screw my regulator out. Screwing my regulator in allows more air to flow through this regulator and into the hose. Screwing it out seals this off. One thing to keep in mind though, if I unscrew this too far, this knob will come off. Takes a little bit of practice, but you'll get the feel of it. You screw it just enough to where it starts feeling loose, then you're done. Okay, oxygen. Go ahead and we turn our oxygen all the way on. Acetylene is the flammable portion of our Oxy Acetylene unit. For safety reasons, we only turn this valve on a quarter of a turn until we see pressure translated onto our regulator gauge here. Okay, so I've got pressure through my system. I go ahead, spray it down with my trusty Windex here, looking for any bubbles that I might see. If I see bubbles, that means I've got a gas leak. I go ahead and I do the same thing to my torch at all the joints to make sure there are no leaks in my system. I have a little bit of a leak here in my oxygen system. I'm seeing some bubbles. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to shut my oxygen system down. And I shut the oxygen bottle off in case I make a mistake and I break something off as I'm tightening it. I don't want this bottle to be open full bore and have this regulator come off at me. So I want to make sure I shut this off before I make any adjustments. Tighten it just a little bit more. Pressure up the system again. And we'll shoot her one more time to make sure we got this leak fixed. No leak. We're good to go. The next step is to light our torch. As I said before, we have an acetylene valve, which is over the red hose. We have an oxygen valve, which is over the green hose. We also have a secondary oxygen valve, which is at the top. So we want to make sure we open our primary oxygen valve up, and we'll control our oxygen flow with our secondary. Okay, so I have my bottle on. I have two gauges on my regulator. The top gauge is the bottle pressure gauge, and it tells me that I have 1200 psi in the bottle. The second gauge is my line pressure gauge. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to use my regulator to adjust this gauge. I'm going to read the inside numbers, not the outside numbers. I'm going to screw in the regulator and I'm going to adjust my pressure up to approximately 40 psi. Next step, we are here at the acetylene regulator. Again, you can see two gauges. The bottom gauge is the bottle pressure gauge, and the top gauge is the line pressure gauge. If you'll also notice on the line pressure gauge, there's red starting at 15 psi. You do not ever want to exceed 15 psi on your acetylene. Typical rule of thumb is you need 5 times as much acetylene or oxygen as you do acetylene. So I have 40 pounds here. I want to go ahead and I want to adjust my acetylene up to 6 psi. Reading the inside numbers, I'm going to go ahead and run this up to 6. Just like that. Easy enough, right? Next step. I have my regulators, my lines, all installed and pressure tested. I have my torch installed and pressure tested. I'm ready to light this torch. Again, primary oxygen valve on a cutting torch, we're going to leave it all the way open. Acetylene valve is closed, oxygen valve is closed. I know I've got pressure to the system because I can hear it running out at the end of the torch when I hit the oxygen trigger. First step, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to turn on the acetylene. And I'm going to turn it on high enough to where I can hear it running out the end of the torch. You can hear a hiss. Now, that's an acetylene fire. If I turn the acetylene fire down, you'll notice the black carbon coming off the top. That is carbon burning from the acetylene. There's not enough oxygen to burn it completely. This is a carbonizing flame. As you can see, I have a secondary long blue cone inside. If I continue to turn up my oxygen very, very slowly, I get a small series of very defined bright blue inner cones in the inner flame. Torch is adjusted properly. I can use my oxygen trigger without blowing out the torch. Okay, I'm ready to begin cutting. I've got my torch lit. First thing I want to make sure is that my bottom area is clear. I want to make sure my hoses are out of the way and anything else is out of the way so I don't shower them with sparks. I am right-handed, so I'm going to work from my left, my right, to my left. I'm going to go ahead and rest my hands. I'm going to bring my torch tip down, and I'm going to get my metal good and hot. See it starting to turn red? And then I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to open up my oxygen valve. Notice how I've got my torch pointed to preheat the iron. And I just let the torch work its way through the iron and cut. If I hold the torch too far away from the iron, you can see how it fills back in behind it. So in order to prevent that, we bring the torch tip down close to the iron. See how that prevented it from filling in behind? Okay, so I'm done making my cut, and it's time for me to go ahead and shut my torch off. First thing I want to do is come to my top valve and shut my oxygen off. See? You're going into a carburizing flame. See how that blue inner cone stretches out? And we come into acetylene. Next thing I want to do is I want to shut my acetylene off. Then I hit my oxygen trigger and it'll blow out any flame left. After I have my torch shut off, I can go ahead and I can shut off my bottles. You always want to shut off your bottles. You never trust your valves on your torch to seal because it will leak and all of your gas will leak out. So I shut my bottles off. And then I drain up my lines. Just hit my oxygen. I watch my line pressure and my bottle pressure bleed to 0. And then open up my acetylene valve and watch my bottle pressure and my line pressure bleed to 0. Shut the valves back off when I'm done, and you're ready to hang the torch up. Okay, gang, that's the Oxy Acetelyne unit. Easy peasy lemon squeezy, right? Now that you've watched this video, when you come to class tomorrow morning, go get your coveralls, your safety glasses, your welding gloves, and your pliers, and meet me in the shop. And we'll practice using this during tomorrow's class period. See you tomorrow.